Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. My name is Pope Metallicus, and welcome back to episode 3 of the history of rock and roll, where we're going to be doing a little bit of recap from the last episode to kind of lead us into the where we're at, and then we are going to be going up into the end of the 1960s. So we're going to be going through, the Vietnam era, the psychedelic era, all the really cool bands that everybody knows from classic rock radio, and to help me do that, I have a gentleman here whose show I was on this morning talking to a lovely group of English men named the Rock and Roll Rowdies, a great crowd. They've been touring for decades at this point. They're real veterans of the industry. Lovely guys, really great to talk to. Don't worry, though, this guy's nothing like that. You know him. He's here all the time. Well, please welcome back to the show, that 70s rock fan. How's it going, man?
Greetings. It's going well, mate. How are you?
Doing great, man, and I'm glad to be getting to this era because this is some of my favorite music of all time. Like, I may be a huge metalhead, but this is kind of where that whole scene comes from.
Yeah.
So it's just like this.
Yeah,
this is the origin story of my music.
We're going to get into the guys we were talking to this morning started working in, which is interesting.
Yeah. Like about what, 67, 68?
69, 70, kind of, 69, I think they were talking about. So yeah, that was a great show this morning. Thank you for joining me.
No, it was great to be there, man. Like I said, I've loved getting to know those guys over the last couple of weeks, and you guys should all go check out those shows either on Morning Coffee with Brian over on Pop Culture Minefield. Or It's Only Talk and Roll, which you can find me on every Monday on his channel. They're both. We've had interviews with them on I think every one of them except Mark.
Well, Mark I'd not even met until yesterday. Really, he's been busy because he was still touring with Wishbone Ash or Martin Turner. So he's the only one of the three that's kind of still doing that stuff regularly. So it's first chance had to meet him, but he was a good bloke, and the four of them together were fucking hilarious.
Oh, absolutely great.
Yeah, and there's a playlist on my, if you go to that 70s rock fan channel, there's a playlist for all the rowdy stuff we've got. I'm looking to try and clip some of that stuff as well. I need to figure out how to get nice little clips and whatever. It takes
I mean, for some of my recorded stuff that I've been trying to do, I've been using CapCut recently. It's fairly easy to use.
Well, it's not even that. It's finding which bit I want to clip because of the video or show. I'm like,
is knowing where you want to be.
I'm trying to find an automated transcript thing, not to derail us from what we're doing here, but something that will automatically go through the video and make a text transcript of it. And then I can at least go, oh, that bit, okay.
Yeah, or at least like timestamps of like the major events.
It's just otherwise.
Okay.
Yeah, but anyway.
Before we get too far into it, we got a couple of familiar faces in the chat. The Sentinel, always good to see you, man. Can't wait to have you back on the show. And then Papa Cotton, as usual. And Christian DeWarm, good to see you, man. Good to see you this morning, too. Always good time to have you guys here. Thank you for joining us for this. And I guess we'll start with a little bit of a back up into like 64, 65, where we had the rise of surf rock in America and that whole scene, and a little bit more of the Spanish influence coming into rock and roll in the U.S. scene, which will become important later. That's what we call foreshadowing in the business. And over on the other side of the pond, you had this massive wave of English rock bands that all of a sudden, within like a year or two, just broke into the States. And you had, obviously superstars like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Who. We're going to get into them a little bit here because this man here was a young lad.
Young lad. Well, the Beatles were starting to be at the height of their fame when I was born. So
yeah,
it is the earliest stuff I remember hearing on the radio as a kid.
Well, Penny Lane. They would have been super popular at that time.
Penny Lane distinctly sticks in my head. I remember listening to it in the kitchen. My mother had the radio, and that's it's funny how it just stuck right in my brain.
As ones to stand out. That's right up there.
But yeah, I mean, a total cultural phenomenon with these British bands, all who were all inspired by the American rock and roll guys who led the way. And there was literally that pause between the flowering of those rock and roll guys who all then, like Elvis went in the army, blah, blah, blah. There was like that little gap, and then all these guys that inspired suddenly went boom in Britain. But the fact that they managed to bring it back over to America was the incredible fact. Nobody foresaw that. Like British acts making it in America? Nah.
I've said it. I said it in the last episode where it was really cool to see another culture take what we had done musically, kind of put their own spin on it and their own little cultural take, and then throw it back at us. And it was even more popular than the stuff that we did.
Yeah, it's the weirdest thing. I don't think anyone would ever have foreseen British music becoming at all popular in America of any genre. It just like it was always the other way. Jazz, blues, soul, or whatever always went the other way. And you know, British acts would have been seen as like nothing in America or cheese. I guess you might have had one or two artists, maybe I can't even think of any, but this thing that just went back like that. I mean, it was
especially in the
no one
American
could have
attitudes
predicted
to it, because we always looked at British music as very like sort of uptight, very classical inspired, like much more stodgy than what rock and roll would become. And yet it was that working class British sound, like, you know, combining jazz and all this other stuff and early rock and roll that really spoke to a lot of Americans. And it was I think it was the last thing people expected for the English to resonate with it and throw it back at us.
Cool. I mean, you might have expected like English actors had always been popular in Hollywood, and you had the whole Shakespeare thing. You had a lot of classical stuff and a lot of literature, but in terms of music, I mean, British music, other than the classical stuff, had all been music hall, which is the equivalent of vaudeville.
Yeah.
You know, it's very little. Nothing would have been seen as cool by, you know, America that had a jazz since the 20s and blues, and to say, oh, all these British acts are suddenly going to become not just popular but significantly popular.
And especially the blues, especially some of the bluesier acts, like, you know, Clapton and all that, we'll get into later. Like they took a uniquely American style and not only took to it like a fish out of water, they started doing it better than some of the American guys.
Well, they did, and the black blues artists in America, who were really a niche thing and well overlooked, many of them in their home country, were like seen as gods in Britain. I remember the Stones when they first visited Chess Records it's like 65 or something, and the Muddy Waters was there. He was painting the studio wall because he wasn't recording, and you know, he was just chipping in to help. What's the guy that ran Chess? My mind's gone. Just helping out, and they went, Muddy Waters is painting the wall of the studio. He's like a god to us, and he was like, well, I got to earn a living, man. You know, just it was that kind of thing. They were revered, and they all used to tour in Britain and get a hero's welcome. The blues stuff in the late 60s in Britain was just this enormous thing. Whereas in America, it was still like, you know, like Richmond Jazz and Folk Festival type thing, you know?
Yeah, well, and I think part of it too is our exposure to it, like, because we heard a lot of it. Like, if you lived in the South or, you know, you were into that scene, you heard a lot of that music throughout the 50s and 60s. Whereas to Britain, it must have been completely new.
It was exotic, very exotic. I remember as a kid listening to, like, maybe like in the late 60s, listening to my brother and sister playing stuff like Fleetwood Mac, and I mean the original Fleetwood Mac with Peter Green and Danny Spencer. Jeremy Spencer and Danny Kerwin, and I'm thinking, what is this thing? And it was all blues and slide guitar and whatever. I'm like, wow, where's that from? What's that? You know, it was dangerous and exciting and exotic.
Yeah, although after you've held almost every one of the guitar players we're going to be talking about tonight lists B.B. King directly as a reference, and Muddy Waters and all those guys too. Like, these guys were like keyed into it.
The one exception I would say, and I think we may have talked about this before, is the Beatles were very much less into the blues and much more into soul and R&B, And so John Lennon used to satirize it by saying, "Oh, here's another song we're going to do by Lead Belly Lemon, whatever," and it was like maybe a Smokey Robinson thing or something that they were covering. They were like, they
much
were
more
not,
came from the jazz side of it.
Yeah, they were much more straightforward rock and roll guys, and into more soul, and they were early adopters of Motown in their playlists. And whereas the Stones and the Yardbirds were blues purists.
Oh yeah, I mean, you can tell by listening to any of the early, like like you say, the Stones, the Yardbirds, even a lot of the Who. Like it's all just straight blues and rock and roll influenced.
Yeah, the other thing though, it wasn't just with the British invasion. It wasn't just the music. The one thing the British did add onto the top of all this was the whole mod thing, and I think a lot of that fashion and culture came with the music. So David Bailey's photography and the models like, well, later on Twiggy, but earlier Gene Shrimpton and others, who Chrissy Shrimpton went out with Mick Jagger, of course, for many years. But there was more than just, there was the haircuts, there was the boots, there was the suits, there was a whole range of stuff came with the music, and that wasn't seen either. I mean, why would Americans need British photographers? They've got lots of their own, Well, here's David Bailey, and he's suddenly become super famous as a photographer,
Yeah, and you can never tell where your stuff's going to land. Like especially as an artist, it's just whoever vibes with it and whoever it really speaks to. And I think America in the mid '60s, like yeah, there were new rock and roll artists coming out, but it was all kind of starting to sound formulaic and very similar. And then you had this whole new sound come from across the Atlantic. And first of all, it was new and exotic because it was not American. And then, like you say, you had this whole different style and mannerism to it. And it was, I mean, it was like catnip to us. Everybody listened to it.
And I think one of the things we're going to talk about is the impact that had on a variety of musicians in America, young musicians who perhaps had been doing like folk or blues or country or all these other genres, and they suddenly heard this British invasion stuff and went, maybe I should be in a rock and roll band.
Yeah, I mean,
So, like,
the first guys on our
Byrds,
list on that, actually, we'll pull up the graphic here. So
the Byrds would be an example of that, a perfect example.
The Byrds are a perfect example of that.
Folk jug band
that then kind of did some more rock and roll stuff. The Mamas and the Papas too.
Let's do some rock and roll. Let's get 12-string Rickenbackers, and so there was because America still had all these genres. The British stuff was just like en masse.
Yeah, and we had so many different types of music from all over the country that was kind of slowly amalgamating, and then the British invasion kind of put some pressure on it and forced that.
Christian Delorme mentions a good point. Where Christian mentions Dylan, and this Bob Dylan is something the British didn't have, of course.
Well, of course.
And was a huge influence on them. But again, they influenced him too, to get out of folk and get into electric rock music.
Oh,
so
yeah,
it worked both ways.
That's always hilarious when you see this guy's influenced by a British artist who is then influenced by an American artist who is then influenced this British artist. So
which is great because it's kind of like a melting pot of music.
Yeah, and that's kind of what America does at its peak, is take stuff from everywhere else and then kind of mold it into what we want to do with it, and it's kind of an amalgamation of everything else. And the first band we're going to get to here was one that, like you say, was kind of doing more folk and country stuff, and then heard the Beatles and all this other stuff.
Hard Day's Night, and then they went, ooh, maybe we should do this.
These guys are onto something. We might want to get in on that. And of course, I'm referring to Christian's favorite band, and one we've both done an episode on our channels about, the immortal Creedence Clearwater Revival.
Yeah, now what an interesting band, because whilst being influenced by the British, inspired by the British beat boom, they were determined, or John Fogerty was determined, to make it as authentically American as he could. Right. Unlike certain other acts like the Byrds, who pretty much aped for a long time, a British sound. These guys were actually one of the few bands I would say that actually went out to challenge the British invasion. Once they decided after hearing them they didn't want to be a jug band anymore or whatever the hell it was. It's we could do that too. But let's try and at least do it our way. They were almost a reaction.
Yeah,
in some
and
ways.
it was kind of showing off a little even more of the American side of things back to the British audience in a way. It was just like, yeah, you guys do this, but here's how it would sound like if everyone was from Louisiana, even though we're all from California.
Yeah, well, indeed, yes. So they were imposters too, but no, they and you can look at this band as, and I know we did an entire show on them on my channel, and I thought one of our best shows. I'm pretty sure you were there too, mate. I seem to recall. They're almost as important as the Beatles or the Stones to me in of 60s bands, and the legacy is enormous.
Absolutely. I mean, these guys and bands like them, including a lot of British acts like Eric Burdon and the Animals and the Hollies and all these guys, would basically form the soundtrack to the Vietnam War, which was heating up right about this time.
It's interesting you mentioned the Hollies because some of their later hits, like Long Cool Woman in a Black Dress, and
still one of my favorite guitarists of all time.
Yeah, they all aped CCR. They adopted a CCR sound in the early 70s from their previous beat pop sound that they'd had so successfully in the 60s. They moved to a more of a CCR type sound in some of their hits in the 70s. So
yeah, and you're going from like 65 with the real height of the British invasion, because the Beatles came over in 64, and within a year, all the rest of the main ones had followed them. And then, because it was just like, we love the Beatles. What else do you have?
What else have you got? Yeah,
yeah, just like, I love that. Now give me something different. Like
Stones, the Who, the Hollies. Some of them went on to last, and others fell by the wayside, like Dave Clark 5 or whatever. But
that happens in every genre, where you're going to have those guys that have that one hit that goes mega huge, and then in 6 months nobody knows who they are because they never did anything else.
Yeah, it always surprises me when I look at it, although I do love the band and I shouldn't be surprised, that the Hollies were second only to the Beatles. Were the only band that outsold them in Britain in the 60s. The Hollies were the second biggest selling band right up to like 72, 73. And they were huge in America too. The Hollies for a long time. So they actually, nobody ever thinks of that. They think the Beatles, the Stones, the Who, the Kinks maybe, and then everybody else. The Hollies outsold the Stones and the Who easily. The Stones were never the biggest selling band, but they had a big impact.
And I think they were more of the rockers side of the rock and roll or the British invasion, where like the Beatles were more on the mainstream, like family friendly side of the house. The Stones were the bad boys with the leather jackets and all that were still.
They also made better record deals than the Beatles, so they might have sold less records, but they made more money because they had better deals.
Also very true.
It's funny that I like the fact that you've mentioned Creedence, and I know Christians mentioned the Doors. The American bands that we think of from that era are not the ones that tried to copy the British, like Paul Revere and the Raiders or other bands like that. The ones that lasted were the ones that tried to remain American sounding. Creedence, the Doors, the band, which was 99% Canadian, of course, but let's call North American. The ones that tried to remain true to, whilst loving and being inspired by the British bands, didn't try to copy them. They're the ones that are still seen as the and the Beach Boys, of course, which had their own thing entirely and indeed predated the Beatles. They're the ones that lasted, I think, in terms of legacy.
Well, because they sounded unique. Like, it wasn't they were trying to do what somebody else had done. They were trying to take what somebody else had done and then build off it and create something
and still
new.
Be American, though.
Yeah. And CCR certainly succeeded that. Nobody sounds like this and nobody ever should take that CCR. Leave that's their gig.
Yeah, and bands have certainly copied or been inspired by them, but there is only one CCR, and I think the tragedy is that they only made 5 albums, albeit in a short space of time. Like, they churned them out.
Yeah, it was all like a 4-year period where they did all of that.
Yeah, and to think what we could have had if John Fogerty hadn't got involved in all those legal wrangles and things hadn't been acrimonious, they would still be a colossal band for years.
Oh God, yeah, I'd say they'd be up there with, you know, the Stones or the Who, where they did have like a 40-year career.
Oh, I think so. I mean, it's not that Fogerty isn't still going, of course, but all those legal wrangles stopped him playing his own. He stopped him playing his own songs live.
Oh yeah, that was one of the most bullshit things ever. Where it's just like, oh yeah, it sounds too much like CCR. Yeah, I know.
Yeah, which is why his solo material, Centerfield was huge. I mean, there's no doubt about it.
Still one of my, especially as a kid who grew up playing baseball, it's like every game you'll hear that song at least.
It's just one, and I remember when I heard that album, and I actually bought it on a cassette. That's how old I am. I bought the cassette. I played that thing till you could see through it. I thought, what is this? This is so good. Where's this guy been? Because in between he had made records, but because of all the bullshit, it just never really.
Yeah, I think he still toured and did other stuff, but he was just kind of done with it for a while.
Well, I think he had a band called the Blue Ridge Riders or something. I've got a couple of they've got their album, but he did it anonymously because he wanted to get away from the legal shit. And
he names this band the Blue Ridge Riders. For those of you who are not in America, I live in the Blue Ridge, and I can assure you it is nowhere near California. It is in fact in Virginia, on the other coast.
There's actually a famous old song which was done by Laurel and Hardy in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia by the Trail of the Lonesome Pine. Yep. In the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia.
Which I actually live right in where that song's talking about.
For some reason, that song with the accompanying black and white footage of Laurel and Hardy singing it became a huge hit in Britain in the 1980s. For some bizarre reason, I don't know why, and it was like number
Laurel
one.
and Hardy had done in like the 30s.
Yeah, and it became number one for a few weeks in Britain. For some reason, it got released.
The really good stuff you'll see pop up again and again in cycles. Like I remember a few years ago, I don't know what it was, but like all over Facebook or whatever, I started seeing the Who's on First sketch by Abbott and Costello.
Yeah.
And it just never stopped being funny.
Sometimes these things just come back, like boom. And I know that Stan Laurel was originally English, so maybe it's something to do. Maybe he died or something, I don't know. But it became a huge hit, and it was the weirdest thing. Everyone's going around singing "In the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia," and because it's a really cute video of them doing it, a cute clip from one of their movies of them doing it. It was the Blue Ridge Rangers. In fact, I'm going to go get that album.
Okay, excellent.
Don't go away. Where am I? Oh, there you go. Stop cam.
But no, it's really interesting that like he kept doing like much more country stuff, like more of the Delta blues and more John Denver style country stuff when he grew up on the opposite coast from all that. Oh, really? I did not know that. So Ike Turner did do something good later in his career. And we may get to some of that stuff, and in a little bit here. We're kind of leading into the psychedelic era because these guys actually had a hand in forming a lot of that, and some of the folk and more country influence going into, the Summer of Love in '67, which is really where the psychedelic movement got started. And kind of again. Somebody sees an artist do something that's really good and really excellent and kind of spins it off into their own thing, which is a recurring theme throughout this whole series is, an artist doing something really cool and then somebody else iterating off of it and creating something totally different sounding, but still in the same vein. So that's really excellent. I
can't find that album, but it's because when I moved in here, I piled all the albums in there and they're not in order. So
oh yeah. I mean, I think most of my stuff is still in storage out in the shed, essentially.
or I filed it under a different thing. And
yeah, I mean,
I file things by the first letter, except if it's the artist. I'll file it by the first letter of their surname if it's a solo artist. But then,
and then, of course, if you're like me, when you start moving, everything's going to a timetable and everything goes in an organized fashion. And then by the end of it, you got to be out like tomorrow, and shit's just going in whatever box it fits in.
yeah, exactly. But yeah, the Blue Ridge Rangers is a good album. It's all, but because it's got not a single John Fogerty written song in it, because of all the legal shit, he just did standards. So like Working on a Building and Jambalaya, stuff like that. Blue Yodel Number 4, old Jimmy Rogers song. It's beautiful though. It's like it's Creedence, but it's all standards, you know.
Yeah, and CCR not only kind of led into the psychedelic movement in a way with a lot of the California scene, but they also kind of kicked off this string of Southern rock a lot too, with bands that came up later in the 60s, but like bands like the Allman Brothers.
Yeah, there's a link. There's definitely a link.
Moving. And these guys actually are from the South.
Well, they are really. They are from the South. That's true. But there's the Creedence. It's like if you draw on the lines and you see these maps of rock and roll stuff. You draw the lines from Creedence. Some of it goes that way in psychedelia. Some of it goes that way into roots stuff. Some of it goes that way into Southern rock. There's certain bands are seminal. I don't think.
Yeah, I mean, there's certain bands that are like close to the center that like everybody got influenced by, like Elvis, the Beatles, Bob Dylan, that kind of stuff, and then and then they just influence everything else.
Yeah, and I think Creedence to this day, John Fogerty and Creedence to this day, still get huge respect for the fact that they kept it. John Fogerty always wanted to keep it as pure as he could.
Yeah.
So there was no elaborate over instrumentation on stage. It was just the four of them. It was what you would now call. There's a name for it. It's not lo-fi, but it's absolutely stripped down to its basics.
Yeah, basically like the core rock and roll of
core. Yeah,
two guitar players, a drummer, and a bass player.
Yeah,
that's it.
Core. It's down to its core. Very little extra instrumentation on the records. Pure. He was a purist in that respect, which is weird because
that's how rock started was just a couple of guitars and or a piano and a bass and drums, and that's it.
Yeah, and he didn't want to, just given that they were a big band in the psychedelic era. He didn't. There's a touch of that here and there with the backing vocals being phased in and out on some of their tracks, but not hugely psychedelic. He just kept it as rootsy and straightforward as he could.
Yeah, that kind of comes in later, and I can see the White Stripes in a lot of this era stuff.
I bet you if you ask,
very stripped down, almost more late 50s than anything.
I bet if you ask Jack White, he'd probably say that John Fogerty was a huge inspiration. I'd like
the Black Keys as well. They have some stuff that would not sound out of place in the late 50s or early 60s.
I can listen to the El Camino by the Black Keys, and you could close your eyes and say that could be a late 60s album.
And especially like was it that big one they had a few years ago, Gold on the Ceiling? Like you can hear the 60s rock in that. It's just like, yeah, I know exactly where this came from.
Rootsy, that's the word. Yeah.
Okay.
Love that stuff. But the Allmans were a different beast in some respects, and that they were, and we're going to talk about the Grateful Dead, even though I don't like them much. The Allmans were a jam band.
Yeah.
They loved long instrumental passages where they could stretch out their instrumental prowess.
And God, I love when they do that, because songs like Jessica are just like hypnotic. It's just like I'm not shutting this off.
You can tell they were all doped out of their heads.
Well, yeah.
Smoking, man. But they loved to stretch out on stage, particularly, and that was something you wouldn't have got. And I wonder what you think about where that change happened, because if you go back to 1966, you wouldn't have heard anybody doing a 20-minute jam on a record or on stage necessarily in the rock world. such as it was becoming. But by 72, 73, lots of bands were doing that.
I think a lot of a band we're going to get to it later here really started with the progressive bands in the late 60s, and then a little bit the creation of heavy metal with bands like Iron Butterfly. I mean, like, let's face it, In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida is what?
It's 20 minutes? 20 minutes plus, yeah. They made up the whole side of an album.
Yeah, and I don't care because the song still kicks ass.
Yeah, it does.
But I think
classic riff. Yeah,
I think at this point, like, it was all focused towards radio play because, like, that's where the money was. That's how you get your name out there, and you can't do that with a 20-minute, musical masterpiece. You got to keep it under like 4 minutes for radio stations to even take a look at it.
You got to wonder if there's a number of factors. One of it might be the type of drugs people were taking, because when they were taken back in the early 60s, it was all uppers and speed and whatever. And then they moved into the sort of pot smoking, LSD taking era, where that's bound to have an impact on your perception of time.
You're not wrong, and it's right about this time too. Which is a perfect segue into our next band that neither one of us like, but they are extremely formative, the Grateful Dead.
Yeah, and here they are in their high fashion era, where they were clearly, the haute couture was strong with them. Jesus, I don't know. It's just me. I've never warmed to the Grateful Dead.
They have a couple of tracks that I vibe with, but most of it's just like, eh.
I remember hearing a live radio broadcast I think it was 1980, and it was a double bill. This was I think it was on the BBC radio, and it was FM stereo, which they'd introduced on radio for quite some time ago. But it was a double bill of The Who and the Grateful Dead. So The Who went on first, and it was as usual, it was brilliant. And then the Grateful Dead came on, and I was like, okay, I'm going to sleep now. It was just, the contrast was just...
Well, I mean, after a band like The Who, you almost need a band like this to come back down off of it, even if that is kind of like the musical version of doing a line to get on stage and then shooting up to come down after. Looking at you, Ozzy.
I know that I'd understand that they have their fanatical fans, and actually it's an early example of that a bunch of people, the Deadies, who just didn't give a shit. That was their thing, and you've got fanatical followings like that for many bands now that's their life.
Especially in this era, like going into the Summer of Love and the hippie movement and all that, a lot of people would just pack up in their van, because a lot of them didn't have a house, and would just go on tour with the band, essentially.
Actually, now that I think about it, because they used to play for free, and I think eventually one or two of the bands said, "Look, we've got to eat here." There was we need to eat. There was a little bit of internal dissension, but we need to buy new guitar strings and stuff. A bit of internal dissension. But I remember Pete Townsend again doing an interview in that era, and he said, because he's got a houseboat on the River Thames where he lives, he said, "Yeah, the fucking Grateful Dead would come around every day and eat everything because they had no money and they didn't have their own whatever." And he eventually says, "I had to tell them to fuck off." He was sick of them eating them, coming around. "Oh, Pete, hey, how are you, buddy? Hey,
Yeah, right.
Fuck off."
You can easily picture Jerry too coming in like, "Hey, man," just being the nice fuzzy teddy bear he was.
But musically speaking, how would you assess their legacy and their output?
They were very musically progressive at the time, in that they were willing to try different stuff and try new chord progressions and new instruments that people would have looked sideways at. I mean, in their case, it was usually for a very good reason, but I do I admire them for their willingness to do that, because a lot of bands and a lot of labels would just go like, "No, this is what you're doing. This is what works. We're going to go with that." And that kind of formed the psychedelic era, that and a lot of LSD.
It's interesting that they did start out as a very heavily psychedelic band, but they did at one point take a turn into country roots territory. with Truckin', which was mentioned in that album that,
Yep.
that Truckin' was on.
Casey
It's
Jones a little bit too.
got
A
the
little bit
train
more
on the
country.
cover. I can't remember the name of it, but they very definitely said we're going to make a folky, rootsy country album, and it worked. They actually was probably their most commercially successful stuff.
Well, yeah, because like I mean, most of it was like, oh shit, like, these guys are actually doing like what we wanted, and they could actually be played on the radio for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, huge influence. Absolutely, I think the fact is that they didn't have a lot of radio. Well, they didn't get AM play. Obviously, didn't have hits, so that probably diminishes their legacy in some people's eyes because they were not as well. Grateful Dead is a niche band, but they had a fanatical following.
And Davina, Phil Spector was a major record executive at this time. He was one of the guys who decided whether you made it or not.
Phil
So
Spector's almost a guy for me that lives outside of the normal bounds of pop and rock because he's just so unique and such force himself. What do you compare him to?
yeah, I mean, it's to the point where he's almost like Google, where his name has become synonymous with what he did.
Indeed, so. Yes. But he laid it all out, and he said, "I want to make symphonies for the kids, little symphonies for the kids," and he used those artists and the orchestration as a way of doing that wall of sound. It didn't matter who the artist was.
Yeah, it's like basically he could take whatever band and make a record and sell. That would sell with that formula.
He was the artist, yeah. And enduring legacy, and that wall of sound is a thing that many people grew to love. Like Brian Wilson absolutely adored it.
Yeah, and it kind of came back with the later metal era where you just have this massive cacophony of instruments all at once. But
and it takes a lot of mixing that when you've only got like 2 tracks or 4 tracks. It took a lot of miking, a lot of mixing.
Oh yeah. I mean, and that was changing rapidly as well as the recording technology had come a long way since 1960.
Yeah, Spector's one of the guys that helped drive that forward, of course, and always used the greatest session musicians.
Him and the Beatles were huge in that too. Like every time there was a new technology that could be used in a production house, they were like, "Yes, give me. I want to play with that."
Yeah. So Davina mentions Phil Spector's work with the Beatles. I'm much more of you could call me a snob. I'm much more of a fan of the Let It Be Naked, the non-Phil Spector mixes that they released a few years ago than I am of the Phil Spector stuff, because to me the excessive orchestration he added to certain tracks on there was too much.
Yeah.
And John liked it because he said he took a pile of shit and turned it into something. I actually don't particularly agree with that, because when you hear the Let It Be Naked album that the Beatles released without all the Phil Spector stuff, I actually think it sounds beautiful because it was the way they intended it. Just the 4 of them plus Billy Preston on some tracks playing in the studio live. It wasn't meant to be overdub, you know.
Yeah, I do like both takes on that album because they're 2 very different ideas with the same music behind them.
Yeah,
and one is like very stripped down Beatles doing Beatles things the way they wanted to do it, and that's awesome, and I really enjoyed that. And then you have, the Phil Spector, like super spectacular, like super produced version, and that sounds great in its own way as well.
Yeah, I mean, if you listen to The Long and Winding Road, both versions, well, there's more than 2, but listen to the Phil Spector one and you listen to the one with just Billy Preston playing the electric piano in the middle. The Phil Spector one, actually, I think it's the orchestration starts nicely, but by the end, it's just like this sweeping wall of mush. Whereas the Billy Preston thing on the original one, it's beautiful.
Yeah, I think they there was this temptation to go too far with it. Like it was great to a point, and now you've hit that point.
Yeah, and did Phil Spector ever prove that he could record something without having 1,000 tracks in it, as Davina said, 1,000 plus tracks?
I mean, I don't think he ever recorded most things. I don't think he ever did anything stripped down, never.
I think maybe the first John Lennon album might have been produced by him, and that was fairly stripped down. But I think that's probably because John pretty much did it himself, and Phil Spector was just there. But
yeah,
yeah, he was. But I mean, I'm not knocking him because this guy could write. I mean, some of those tunes are. You think of just the early Ronette stuff and the Crystals and whatever. These are classics.
Davina brought up them too.
Yeah, classics.
And even some of Tina Turner's early stuff in the 70s had his involvement, I think, a little bit. Usually behind the writing desk, not the production booth.
But Davina's got a good point, though, by mentioning him, because he is like the Grateful Dead, like CCR, like the Doors. He's American. There is no British Phil Spector.
Yeah.
If you know what I mean.
He was uniquely American thing.
Yeah, a uniquely American guy with a uniquely American sensitivity and artistic sensitivity, albeit that some of his stuff was aping, European classical styles. But he also his influence on the Beach Boys, and then the whole session group that were around that with Glenn Campbell and people like that playing in that band. They were all heavily influenced by Phil Spector, so he drove another strand of American pop music.
Yeah, I mean, again, like the Grateful Dead, like I'm not the biggest fan of their work, but what they led to is something I'm a massive fan of. And one of the early artists that kind of jumped in on the psychedelic bandwagon, and still one of my favorite instrumentalists of all time, actually covers both the American and British sides of the house, because Jimi Hendrix in '67 really took off. And the way this man played guitar was just insane. There was nothing like him.
It's true. I mean, people use the word icon all the time and misuse it and overuse it. Oh yeah, so-and-so is an icon. No, they're not. This is an icon. There is only one Jimi Hendrix.
And when you combine the fashion with the musical style, with his vocal style, it was kind of like someone took Little Richard, put a Napoleonic era British uniform on him, threw a guitar in his hand, gave him a whole bunch of LSD, and then sent him on stage.
Yeah. And who saw this coming again? I mean, when you look at this very early footage of him playing in James Brown's band and in some other bands, is it James Brown? He's playing in a certain band's, Little Richard's band, as a backing guitarist. Yeah. Nobody could see this coming. He looked like just another backline guy.
Yeah, he was a session musician mostly, like you said, he'd be behind Little Richard and somebody else. And then they put him in the recording booth, and all of a sudden the man lit up.
Yeah, and he did it by going to Britain.
Yep.
Who opened their arms to him and said, wow, what is this guy? And it's funny because he went from just a backline guy to this wild, crazy, experimental, ferocious lead guitar blues, psychedelic blues rock guy without almost any hint that was there before. It's weird. It's like he suddenly a cover was pulled off.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he might just be one of those guys that if you tell him to play something normal and like tell him how to play it, he'll just play it and won't iterate on it at all, and just kind of okay, whatever. And then if you just send him on stage and give him absolutely no instructions, he'll just go nuts.
Yeah, singular artistic vision, and a guy who just wanted to play. The thousands of hours of him jamming with other artists and whatever, there's like tens of thousands of hours of tape lying around. He just wanted to play. He liked to drink and have the girls and take drugs too, but he was always playing. I can't believe that you take a guy that was like 1 minute he's just playing some chords in the back of Little Richard's band, the next minute he's burning his guitar on stage after playing a blinding solo.
Just like the next minute you get All Along the Watchtower. Like, wait, what?
Yeah, like and I guess he soaked in the British stuff and admired the British artists like Eric Clapton and so on, But
And
then
you had a couple of breakout real guitar guys in the 50s with, Chuck Berry and a couple of the other ones. But then you have Jimi Hendrix, and he's like at the front of a whole new wave of guitar players that became more the stars of their band than anything else.
Oh, absolutely, mate. And I just noticed Christian says he played and also he played a right-handed guitar, left-handed, upside down. So he's actually playing a guitar upside down there.
Yeah.
So the strings are reversed from normal for us normal players.
Yeah, if you asked a right-handed guitar player to play like that, I would be completely freaking lost.
I think it's
any guitar player, even you put a left-handed guitar in his.
Why are the thick strings at the bottom and the light strings at the top? Yeah, and all credit to Chaz Chandler of the Animals, who picked him up and became his manager and took him to Britain and got him ensconced with various people and got him the opportunities to play, like as early as '66, playing live on British television and playing in the Marquee Club and stuff like that.
And yeah, Davina, he was mostly self-taught. He just kind of picked up a guitar and just started playing.
Yeah, there are a handful of artists in the 20th century that will be seen as true icons: Frank Sinatra, Bob Dylan, Jimi Hendrix, and Elvis, possibly.
Later on, Eddie Van Halen would go on to kind of be the next one.
Very, very few, not the thousands that they talk about. There's very few. There is only, and ever will be only, one Jimi Hendrix. And it's just ferocious when you see the stuff that he did, but so clever as well. Clever and experimental.
I talk all the time about I would have loved to have seen him later in his career, because of course he died when he was 27.
What a waste. Yeah.
And he died the day that Paranoid by Black Sabbath was released. I would have loved to have seen what he would have done with heavy metal, because that was where he was going anyway.
Imagine him headlining something like the California Jam in '74, where all those bands like Sabbath and Purple played, or imagine him headlining the Reading Festival.
Oh my God. Would have turned into Woodstock 2.0.
Yeah, with all the metal bands and whatever. Imagine him collaborating with those guys. And I'm sure he would have done other stuff too, but he would have been able to turn his hand to that stuff.
Well, I think he would have just taken to metal like a fish out of water, because that was where his style was naturally going anyway. Because the further on he got, the more like the heavier and bluesier he seemed to get.
Yeah. But it's funny
that the last stuff he did was stuff like Voodoo Child, Red House, stuff like that, and it's all brilliant.
Yeah, and it's funny how American artists had to go to Britain to make it, and then when he came back to America, it was like, "Who's this guy from Britain?"
and again, you have that weird juxtaposition of like, "Well, you found this really cool artist from England, yeah, but he's American."
Yeah, what?
Which side of the Atlantic are we on again?
I liked him as well. I mean, he was actually, as it was pointed out, he was a serviceman. He was actually a patriotic guy.
Oh yeah.
They tried hard to force him to badmouth his own country, and it was a bad time, but he wouldn't do it. And he said, "No, I'm playing the Star Spangled Banner like that because I love it. It's a beautiful tune." And it was beautiful the way he played it. Yeah. I just wanted to pop back to something Davina said earlier about the earlier Eagles albums produced by Glyn Johns. I totally agree with her. They're the best ones.
The
first
Eagles
2 or 3.
Spectacular.
Glyn Johns is a great producer, and those albums are much purer than some of the later stuff. But I agree with the lineup thing, because I'm a big Bernie Leadon fan, who had been in the is in the Flying Burrito Brothers and bands like that, and I like that stuff, that early country rock stuff with Graham Parsons, and his role in the Eagles is completely overlooked now. I mean, he was on the first 5 albums, major component of that, and I like that stuff. Some of my favorite Eagles songs are his songs. So.
Yeah, and I think too the label had something to do with that because rock was getting more popular than country was at the time, and they wanted more out of them. And the Eagles just seemed to have that ceiling to go right through into the mainstream. So
Yeah,
I think there may have been pushed in that direction a little bit by their management. And yeah, Soul Assassin. I can only imagine what Lemmy would have done with Hendrix as a kind of his guide. Like, could you imagine a rock band with Phil Lynott playing bass, Lemmy on rhythm guitar, him on lead, and then probably Phil Taylor or one of the other drummers coming in?
There would have been, I mean, I'll imagine a traditional classic rock giant like Cozy Powell or somebody playing drums. I mean, we had Mitch Mitchell, who was brilliant and would have continued to play with them.
Probably.
But imagine slotting him into a lineup with a Cozy Powell or somebody, and just, you know.
It would have been one of the greatest rock acts of all time. I mean, Thin Lizzy, Motorhead, and Jimmy by himself all did pretty good on their own. When you combine that,
monstrous
it's either going to go like the Yardbirds and implode in 6 months, or it's going to be the best thing ever.
There's an apocryphal story, and I think it's supposed to be true. When Hendrix first played the Marquee Club, and of course all the London glitterati were there. Clapton, Townsend, they're all in the crowd. And I think there's a story that Clapton turned to Pete Townsend and said, "Oh, we're all fucked." Because he was, oh, it's right, we're fucked.
Well, I mean, he wasn't wrong. But I mean, and that's the era when you had, Jeff Beck, Jimmy Page, Eric Clapton, all of the Pete Townsend, all these guys just coming out of the woodwork as these brilliant guitar players. Keith Richards in his prime. Give the man his credit.
The rise of the guitar hero is another thing of the late 60s. Yes, there'd been lead guitarists before, like Scotty Moore or whatever, but they were never really the focus. The singer had always been the focus. But once you got Hendrix and Clapton and these guys, the rise of the lead guitarist as this thing was interesting.
And especially with Jimi Hendrix, like, that's kind of where you see the rise of some of the instrumental stuff. Is you almost get to the point where like the audience is like, yeah, we don't care what you have to say, bring him back, we want to see him do the thing. So you had this guy leading into, and another guy we'll get to a little later with more of the Hispanic influence with Carlos Santana coming out in like 66, 67 as well.
Another brilliant one. Well, again, I mean, that fusion of blues and Hispanic stuff, and
then jazz a little bit too, and it just created this gorgeous hypnotic style that dovetailed really, really well with the psychedelic movement, because it kind of had that cool vibe to it.
Yeah, I don't know if you remember. I don't know what it was like in your era, but for me in the 70s, they had high school dances, and always there were certain songs would be played at the end of the night for the slow dances.
Yep,
the erection section, as they used to call it. But they virtually always finished with Samba Pati by Santana.
Okay. With us, it was usually like Stairway to Heaven or something like that, but that's going into the 90s.
Oh, but yeah, I'm talking like 75, 74, 75. So like
Stairway to Heaven was like 3 years old.
Yeah, they didn't really play that for the slow dance section, the Stairway to Heaven. I'm thinking
and then, of course, speaking of live shows, you have the most famous concert in history, one Jimmy performed at, and so did just about everybody else. The immortal Woodstock.
Yeah, I don't see a single outdoor toilet there.
No, there wasn't.
Smells like
I'm wondering how many people had to be treated with things like dysentery in Colorado.
Oh, quite a few, I imagine. Pop quiz. Who was the opening act at Woodstock?
That I don't actually know off the top of my head.
Richie Havens.
Never would. I don't even really know.
I'm not a big fan, but that was just a piece of trivia. He was the opening act at Woodstock.
And yeah, Davina, it was basically just a mud pit with a stage. And
it's a pretty rickety stage as well.
Oh yeah. I mean, well, like we were talking about with the Rowdies, some of those early stages were basically whatever they could cobble together from the local construction site.
That's right.
with a couple of spotlights and
literally
probably enough bolts to hold it up.
Yeah, I mean, you see the movies of it. There's people hanging off those towers there and whatever. And I personally think it would have been a total nightmare.
Oh yeah. Oh, I wouldn't have wanted to be there, but like this is one of those concerts, like the original Reading Festival or Rock in Rio or something like that, where or Live Aid, where it's one of those ones that everybody wants to be at.
Well, Mrs. Rock fan, who lived in Montreal, so not far over the border to New York State, tried to go. She was a teenager, tried to go. The traffic was so bad that they just turned around and went home. They couldn't even. We got over the border, and then the closer they got, it was just like it was a clusterfuck. So they said, "Screw it, we'll go home." Drove home.
Yeah, so. I mean, there was like 280,000 people at Woodstock, so it's like, and they were there for days on end, so it was kind
some of them probably never left.
I did probably, although from what I remember, that area is actually like pretty upscale and pretty well off, so they were probably encouraged to go on their way, shall we say.
So Soul Assassin mentions hippies. Yeah, too many hippies for me.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, but that was just kind of an artifact of this era. Like the 60s, like something we haven't really gone into is like, some of the political and social stuff that was going on at this time. I mean, in 65, you had just had the civil rights movement really kick off and the real kind of overt part of it begin and stuff like that. So race relations in America were at a really weird place. And everyone was just kind of trying to figure it out. On top of all that, you had the Vietnam War going off. And if that wasn't bad enough, you had this constant fear of nuclear annihilation from, the Soviet Union at any given time. So I think that's part of what caused like the psychedelic era is you needed something to get away from it. And for a lot of people, drugs were it.
Good
times.
Drugs
and music.
I was 6 years old. I don't remember any of that. I'm sorry.
Well, I mean,
it seemed like good times to me. I got to watch great little TV shows, and
Well, yeah. I mean, the prevailing opinion on the 60s is if you can remember the 60s, you weren't there.
Yeah, I remember the moon landings distinctly because I was so excited by that. But this,
and that happened right about this time in '69 too, the summer of '69, where you had all of this really horrible shit happening, but then you had that one uniting moment in all of it.
So do you think
almost everybody watched?
Yeah, I mean, I think the cultural significance of Woodstock is far more important than the quality of the music that was played, because a lot of the music was shit, in my opinion, because it was badly set up and there was a lot of acoustic stuff and horrible. There was a couple of good sets. I mean, obviously Hendrix was fantastic. The Who, although I think they played a blinder, Pete Townshend hated it. He said it was terrible. He much prefers the Monterey and the Isle of Wight festivals they did. He said Woodstock was a nightmare and they sounded like shit. And it was 4 a.m. by the time they got on. Other than that, there wasn't a great deal of rock.
It was mostly country and folk stuff.
Yeah, there was Santana. CCR played, but they didn't. John Fogerty was so horrified by the footage and the sound that he didn't want it shown for years. So it's like banned. It's not on any of the films or whatever. So it wasn't that rock, really. It's just me. Culturally, it's significant.
Yeah, and well, I mean, I think Candide was there, Christian, at this point.
They were, yes, they were there.
And they've got some tracks I dig. They were one of the bands they weren't super popular, but they were around at this time. And this was kind of where you saw that side of more country and folk rock.
Woodstock wasn't the first music festival, because there'd always been music festivals, but they were more around the sort of jazz and blues and folk genres. So Richmond Jazz and Blues Festival, Richmond, all the folk festivals, which of course Bob Dylan got right up their noses by starting playing electric stuff. This was the first one that could have been considered rock, I think. So it wasn't the first festival, but the first rock festival. And maybe another.
Phil, of course, I knew you were going to come in as soon as. Although you missed CCR by a good bit, so
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, you had this
country. There you go. I mentioned
but you mentioned like, and it's true that this was like this big cultural event that everybody wanted to be at.
Yeah, and then couldn't stop talking about it for long enough afterwards, and it spawned others. It showed it could be done.
Oh yeah.
Sure, it could
And
be done.
and that people would show up for it, because I think that was really the thing keeping people away from it before, was that nobody's going to show up to see a massive rock concert like that.
Christian's right. Monterey was before this. I think it was a smaller in scale, but it had a large number of artists playing. But Monterey Pop in '67 was before this, and that had an interesting mixture of rock and soul acts in it, because Otis Redding and guys like that played as well. So Monterey was an interesting one. I think this was the first large scale, like 250,000 people type thing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think any American music festival had come anywhere close to this.
And now, of course, you get that. It's like seen as commonplace. A festival of 150,000 people is like, yeah, great, no problem.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, that 91 show that Metallica did with AC/DC in Moscow was what, over 1 million?
Yeah. Yeah.
Which was just insane.
I gotta wonder that if you were at the back of that crowd there, apart from the fact that the ship was all running downhill, probably. No, the ship would be running to the front of the stage. You wouldn't hear much.
No, like if you're out back by the tents and everything, I mean, you might have an advantage in that you can actually go use the toilet if you need to.
True.
But
use somebody else's tent. You know what? I think.
Are you even still in the town of Woodstock at that point? I'm not entirely sure.
You're probably in a different state by this time. Well, some of them were in an altered state, but what's interesting is when you see the Hendrix and Who footage, because they were like 4 a.m., the crowd had thinned out considerably. Like a lot of people had disappeared off home or were up sleeping or whatever. So there's actually a lot more space when those guys are on.
Yeah.
And you can see gaps in the crowd and people are sitting down more relaxed, more room, So those might have actually been an okay experience, those two sets.
Yeah, especially because, like, first of all, the Who, that was famous as being the loudest show on earth at the time it was done. So, that's probably the people in the back could finally hear something. Oh, the concert's finally started. Oh,
yeah, excellent. I think they woke a few people up. Let's put it that way. But yeah, the Who famously always tried to get louder and louder, and they did over time. Various bands have swapped the official record. I think Manowar currently holds
the title at 132 decibels, which is just insane.
At a certain distance, it's a certain distance.
Motorhead had one at 130 and actually started doing structural damage to the venue they were in.
Never mind the ears.
Oh, well, I mean, they were actually like, apparently shortly after that, they had to close that because it was some old theater in Spain somewhere that wasn't in the greatest of shape anyway. And they were literally shaking the building apart to kind of kill the show.
Rock and roll. Well, it's like the Rowdies we're talking about, and we've talked about in a couple of those shows, the Status Quo gigs at the Glasgow Apollo. Famous theatre, which is now no longer in use, unfortunately. The balcony would go up and down 4 or 5 feet when the fans started jumping up and down. And because I have standing under that, the fuck, I'm not standing under that.
There's not a chance of hearing damage. If you don't have hearing damage after a Motorhead show, you weren't there. You were at the bar down the street.
Yeah, I've certainly, yes, I can testify to that. The one time I saw them.
And unfortunately, it's an experience I never got to have live. I would have loved to have seen them.
One time I saw them, but it was on the Ace of Spades tour. So.
Oh, excellent.
And yes, it was loud. And it was in a theater, so it was super loud. It wasn't outdoors. It was in a 2,000, 3,000 seater.
Were people actually pinned to the back wall and held up by the guy behind you?
It was mental. It was one of the greatest nights of my life, but it's ferocious and a ferocious assault on the
Yeah,
census.
and no, but I mean that was a cultural event, and of course it gave us those iconic moments like Pete Townsend smashing his amp, and Jimmy lighting his guitar on fire and throwing it in the
Yeah.
air. And I think that kind of inspired a whole new generation of rock and roll at that point, because the show became part of the band's identity.
Yeah, that's a funny thing, because having a show had always been a thing that was in the soul and R&B world, like James Brown and a lot of the soul acts, Tina Turner, they put a show on. Rock had been more, hey, let's stand here and play our instruments and sing. But actually, guys starting to do stuff like that and put on a performance became the thing, as you say.
Yeah, and the stage and the live presentation became part of the experience rather than just hearing the music, and the stage setting was just kind of there to look nice.
Yeah, they actually had a backline, and then they'd start with better lighting, and then put
And
up
then
a backdrop.
the prog rock era started, and the sets started getting really out of control.
And then lasers were invented, didn't they?
And I think where it got its most ridiculous was probably like the immediate post Spinal Tap era, where you had like the Fight for Your Life tour by Judas Priest, where they had the metal monstrosity from the cover of Defenders of the Faith as their drum riser that was like 40 feet tall.
You know what's fascinating is I often thought, they invented things like rotating drums, drum kits that would go round and round. I often thought what they should do is have the band in the middle and have the whole arena rotate around them. That would have been awesome stunt.
That would be really cool, because that way everybody gets to throw up.
But just keep the band, stop moving the band around, leave them there, and have the whole thing rotate around them. That would have been awesome.
Stop moving the band. They're not moving, you drunk bastard. The show hasn't started yet.
People throwing up everywhere, whatever. But,
well, it's like that old joke about how many Irishmen does it take to screw in a light bulb? It's like 4. 3 of them sit around doing nothing but drinking whiskey. The other one stands in the ladder and holds the light bulb in the socket while the room spins.
That's right, yeah. But yeah, performance started to become a thing, and bands. I mean, there'd been a few bands like The Move in Britain that tried to do kind of a shocking performance thing, but it became much more important. And like Emerson, Lake and Palmer and bands like that, it was all about how can we make 3 guys have this thing that's got a stage full of shit and things flying up and down and keyboards getting thrown over.
A whole production rather than just a couple of amps and whatever backdrop you could afford.
And that's what those rowdies are involved with, just that the development of that. I mean, and yet there were still bands, even at this year, CCR and others, that were still the purest thing. 4 guys in jeans standing around a drum kit, or 1 sitting at the drum kit and 3 standing around it.
Well, and I think it kind of died off like towards the end of the 80s, when bands all of a sudden again realized that, wait, this is all coming out of our cut and the money's not there anymore.
Well, this is it. Yeah, okay, guys, you want a spaceship? Yeah, great.
Yeah,
the record company are going,
not going to mind. They're not the ones writing the check for it.
Here's $500,000 of money, of our money. You're going to have to pay back. Davina mentions the ELO spaceship, which was another incredible thing. I didn't actually. I've seen ELO twice, but I didn't see it. It was post spaceship, and well, at least it wasn't physically a spaceship when I saw them. It was on screen. So that would have been awesome. But the Blue Oyster Cult had one of the earliest big laser shows.
Yep.
I remember when they played in Edinburgh in 1976 in Scotland, they made a huge deal out of this laser show that they had. And that was getting mainstream media coverage because it was so fantastic.
And Soul Assassin, they're not rocket scientists. They're more redneck engineers.
I've often thought that the rocket scientists, the like rocket science thing is a bit of a bad analogy, because rocket science is you take a long tube full of fuel and you light the blue touch paper at the bottom. Pretty simple. Now, brain surgery, that's harder.
Very true. But, That's the moment where you give a roadie or a redneck a roll of duct tape and some zip ties, and he'll make some shit happen real fast.
Yeah, and some of it may be happening to people that were unfortunately in the wrong place at the wrong time. But
we don't ask those questions, and we just kind of pay off the people who do.
Yeah,
Well, we never intended it for their heaven. Here's this $100. Go away now.
Well, exactly. So Woodstock was what, 69? June 69 or something? Or?
I think, yeah, it was like June, either late June or early July 1969. So in the northern part of the United States, that is also...
it would be hot. It would be hot that day.
Very hot and very humid. So made doubly so by the 300,000 other people you have sitting right here.
Yeah, I'm sure there was a lot of conceptions that day as well.
Oh God, yes. There's probably a reason the birth rate skyrocketed in 1970. It's like, Woodstock was like 9 months ago.
So then, I mean, it spawned all these other festivals like the Isle of Wight in Britain, which was a hugely successful one. But also you had the Stones had that really bad one. Is it Altamont? Where a guy died, a guy was beaten to death by the Hells Angels right in front of them. And
yep.
So Summer of Love, but not so much in some places.
Yeah, I mean, and this was kind of the culmination of that whole free love movement that started in the summer of '67 in Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco, and then kind of spawned this whole subculture in America, and became the hippies.
Yeah, and this
was kind of the height of their era.
Yeah, this is, you're right. This was the height of it, even though a lot of that was from the West Coast. This on the East Coast was the height of that hippie Summer of Love stuff. And because at the same time this was happening in other parts of the country, you were like Detroit and places like that, you were getting the rise of proto metal bands, proto punk type bands like the Stooges, the MC5, you were getting the early metal stuff. So it wasn't all, there was a lot of other stuff going on. So while one thing reaches its peak, the other things start to rise.
Well, and the next kind of stage in rock, we're going to get to a couple other artists before we get there, but it was kind of a reaction to a hippie movement from the working class, because a lot of the hippies were kids of, more middle class, upper class people that were all either college students or dropouts. Gee, I wonder why they dropped out. But they were kind of more of the upper crust kids. And meanwhile, you had, more of the working class guys that either couldn't afford to go to college or didn't care to. They just kind of got a job in the factory just like Dad did and got on with it. That's all. The whole thing is kind of stupid.
Yeah, the blue collar stuff was doing its own thing to a certain extent, especially in Detroit. Yeah.
And, of course, you have... again, you have this light touch of Latin influence that comes in with guys like Carlos Santana that kind of adds this weird, I think it kind of adds to the countryside of rock and kind of just accentuates it a little bit with a little more twanginess and a little bit different percussion line and stuff like that.
But there's also a sort of a big Cuban element in a lot of the percussion.
Oh yeah,
it's something that would probably later be called fusion. Rock fusion music, where you took some rock and blues stuff, but there's all sorts of other layers added on it culturally. So a forerunner, yeah. I mean, I can't think of anybody before Carlos Santana that was like Carlos Santana.
I mean, you had a couple of, Hispanic rock bands in Southern California in the 60s, but and of course Richie Valens in the 50s, but I don't think anybody musically had influenced rock as much as Carlos.
I mean, I wasn't living in Southern California or in New Mexico or Texas in that era, but I know that the radio stations in the South and across the border in Mexico were probably having a big influence on guys in that area. They were playing blues stuff, but they would also throw in early rock stuff, and they would throw in other things like you mentioned some of the Hispanic acts that had been around. So they were probably having a bit of an influence. So that's that, particularly in Southern California and New Mexico and Texas, I think.
Yep.
Very different influences from what they were getting in Haight-Ashbury, and very different from Detroit.
No, yeah. Well, it's the Southwest is a really interesting demographic in America because it's one of those places where nobody moved the border, or we just kind of moved the border, and the people never left. So you have this large Hispanic and Mexican population that's basically living in the Southwest U.S. And so like they kind of just had this enclave of like Tex-Mex essentially culture where it's like part Tejano, part Mexican.
And Christians mentioned a couple of the acts like Freddie Frender and the Sir Douglas Quintet.
Yeah, and so you had this very weird amalgamation of American West and Mexican cultures, and that kind of produced acts like Richie Valens and stuff like that because they all heard this rock and roll and they wanted in on it too. So they bands like Los Lobos got started in early 60s.
They to me are the ultimate expression of that Hispanic rock melting pot. You couldn't pick a finer example than that band of.
Oh yeah, because they do it all. Like they do everything from traditional like kind of Mexican style stuff to straight up hard rock
and heavy, very very heavy stuff. Like their cover of Politician by Cream Song, it's pure heavy metal. I mean it's ferocious.
It's like they can do it all.
Yeah, I absolutely adore that band. I mean they're the ultimate flowering of that sort of Southern Californian Hispanic influenced thing. Like Santana was a big part of that. But they just took it to another level.
You see an artist like Santana. Santana had staying power though. Like he was in the limelight for a long time, just purely to his guitar talent. But you had songs that would pop up every now and again from that side of the house, like Tequila or Lowrider, that just kind of pop into existence and capture it for a minute, and then kind of go their own way again. But like it's a very subtle influence. And again, I wish we had Paulie here to talk about this, but he wasn't available because he knows more about this side of music than I think either of us ever will.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he's got a million bands up his sleeve that I'm not aware of.
And current stuff. And that's one of the cool things about living in Southern California is you do get to hear about some of it.
Yeah, and not living in those areas, it's all secondhand for guys like me. It's just stuff that I've heard or been told about. And but to live in those influences and have it shape your music like it did a guy like Carlos Santana must have been something else. I mean, just to hear in one ear to hear all this traditional Hispanic music, and another ear to be hearing country, another one to be hearing blues, another rock. So many years. And then all the rock stuff was going on, the British invasion stuff. I mean, it's because Santana can do it all. I mean, he's got hard rock albums. Like All I Ever Wanted is a great hard rock single from the late 70s. It's a killer, kick-ass hard rock song. There's no Hispanic element to it. It's just pure on rock and roll,
Yeah, I've seen him do a couple of songs live with Tony Iommi in the past, and that was just absolutely mind-blowing to see two virtuosos like that go at it.
Yeah, all the best guys.
There's a lot of jazz influence in here.
Oh, jazz is another thing we never even touched. I mean,
we brought it in the very beginning of the 1950s with Fats Domino and a whole bunch of the other stuff going on like St. Louis and New Orleans, and that kind of formed the early sound of rock and roll. But yeah, it kind of keeps popping up in people's influences from time to time, and it's really just the individual artist how much of it shows. But they had a huge influence on the psychedelic era.
Yeah, and like all the truly unique guys, he's adaptable and able to play in a multitude of styles with a multitude of people. Jeff Beck would be another great example.
And I wish I still had the song. I got it off of Napster when I was like 12, and it was one of the prizes of my collection. Unfortunately, that hard drive died and I couldn't recover it. I had a live recording. It was kind of a bootleg of, I believe it was Jeff Beck, Keith Moon, and Jimmy Page doing Beck's Bolero.
Oh yeah, that's
brilliant.
Yeah, that was when Keith Moon and that was what Jeff Beck was trying to do, something that would become Led Zeppelin-esque before Led Zeppelin. and Keith and Moon and John Entwistle were looking for a way out of the Who because they were fed up with the fighting and screaming and whatever. So there was a point where that could have become what Led Zeppelin became later, because Keith and John wanted to be in Led Zeppelin. You know?
Yeah. Who was it that turned them down? I think it was Jeff Beck that turned it down.
Yeah, he didn't want to go quite that
or one of them said it would go over like a lead balloon and then went back to his thing, and that's why they ended up calling the band Led Zeppelin.
That's right, yeah. Because they were swirling around each other, all of them, trying to get this heavy supergroup thing going.
And they'd kind of already done it once with the Yardbirds, and that they had all been in the band at one point.
Oh, what an incredible band.
Having all those guys. I think they are like, you had too many dominant personalities in that band, because Clapton has led every band he's ever been in. So is Beck.
Yeah.
Keith Moon doesn't care. He's mostly just hammered out of his mind behind the drum kit.
Yeah. No, the Yardbirds were another seminal band, not necessarily successfully commercially, certainly in America, but hugely influential.
They had really good music, though.
Oh, I love the Yardbirds. Absolutely adore them. There's some killer tracks. I've got the box set with all the radio and live stuff on it. It's just killer. And of course, Clapton, Jimmy Page ended up turning it into into Led Zeppelin in the end. There's early versions of Dazed and Confused live with the Yardbirds. Yeah.
And then, of course, Clapton grabbed Ginger Baker out of that group to co-found Cream, essentially.
Yeah, Cream. Well, we haven't even touched that stuff. I mean, Cream.
We're going to get there in a minute, because this is all kind of leading into.
We may get there in a minute, but as I said in the private chat, unfortunately, I'm being signaled that my time is up.
All right. Well,
sorry, mate. Another 10 minutes.
We'll get
5 minutes.
We'll get back to all this stuff eventually.
Oh, we'll do it. It doesn't matter if we have to do it.
It's going to be on either your show or mine. So
it doesn't matter if we have to continue in another one doing from where we left off here.
Oh, that's very true. So we got to like 67. Hey, we got 2 years in this period of rock and roll. So I'm actually happy with that.
I know we're doing all right, given that so many things branch off. This is the thing. It's we even.
This is where you see like the origins of like soft rock, folk rock, psychedelic, and metal all in the same 5-year span.
Yeah, blues rock. They all go that way, and then some of them come back like that.
Yeah, it was kind of like they all shot off, but there's still webs that connect all of them.
Yeah, I mean, you get a band like Cream, which were really a blues rock band that became a psychedelic band that became a heavy band and then split up, but then inspire Led Zeppelin and others to do some of the things they did,
Yeah, absolutely. But we'll save that for next time, because we're about to get into a very interesting time on both sides of the Atlantic pretty much simultaneously.
But it's an explosion now, isn't it?
Yeah, pretty much. It goes from like them playing back and forth against each other to then just both going in the same direction.
Yeah,
they kind of both picked up what the other one was putting down and added the other half in.
It's an explosion of stuff, and that transatlantic thing is huge. Guys going back and forward. The British invasion inspired a bunch of stuff, and then it went back to America, and then it came back in another form, and the Anglo
point, I think you see bands on both sides of the aisle kind of pick up the other half that the other one was missing and add it in, and then you have this very unified style that goes forward out of the 60s.
Yeah, it's a fabulous time. I was lucky enough to remember some of it growing up. I mean, more towards the early mid-70s than the earlier stuff, but luckily, having older siblings, I heard a lot of things that even though I was a kid.
And you probably remember more about the 60s than some of the people who were at these things.
Probably, yeah. I remember things that happened to me.
Fair.
I remember the moon landings. It's the only external thing I can remember.
And that Bolero bootleg might be on YouTube. I will have to.
It probably is now. I mean, if you
almost everything's on YouTube.
But it's an interesting piece of music to do, because it's not Bolero. I mean, it's kind of a weird time signature.
Yeah, it's a very interesting time signature for a rock band to do, but it's really good.
There's another interesting topic which one day we might do, is rock bands covering classical pieces.
Oh, I mean, when we get to the 80s with heavy metal, that's basically every guitar player out there, especially every Swedish guitar player I've ever met is like Beethoven with 6 strings.
Yeah, because there's been a lot of that stuff over the decades, and sometimes it works.
But we will get into all of that in the future. But for now, what do you got coming up, man?
Next show is Saturday night, Bourbon and Boarding, which hopefully you can join if you get the chance, mate. Covering more playoff hockey.
Get a chance to berate my Bruins for not winning yet?
Well, there's Florida's not dead. It's funny how virtually every series is extending, isn't that weird?
Now you're seeing why I refuse to call any shutouts in the
tough, isn't it?
preseason.
Yeah. But yeah, so Bourbon and Boarding Saturday night, and I might be on other stuff, but Monday, 3 p.m. Mountain Time, we're doing Train to Busan on my channel, which I fucking love.
I'm actually glad we're doing that now because it's been on my list of things to watch forever, and now I'm finally going to have to kick it up to the top and get through it.
I mean, it's no secret I love Korean stuff, so it's about time I got into a Korean movie. So that's what we're going to do first.
Yeah, and like you guys, like I think you and Drinker and all these guys started recommending a lot of Korean and Indian stuff, so I put it on my list, and it's just kind of like, oh yeah, I'll have to get to that, and
it's great.
Shit comes out.
Yeah, it's fast, it's tense, it's thrilling, it's emotional. The Koreans have just got their shit together, man. Honestly,
at least more than we do at this point.
Oh yeah. So that's what's happening for me. But what about you, my friend?
Well, I mean, every Sunday we can catch me here for Rock and Roll Religion. I'm actually probably going to be covering Megadeth and some of their early stuff this Sunday. That's going to be a fun show because their early shit is just awesome. I've been on a thrash metal kick for some reason, so I figured I might as well do these guys now. We covered Exodus a couple weeks ago, and then last Sunday I covered Overkill's new record, which is absolutely killer.
Well, I'm going to have to listen to that then. Hang on.
Well, I think the album's called Scorched. It's fantastic. The production sounds clean. They're as good as ever musically.
Thanks for that.
And it's a little more musically progressive than I'm used to from a thrash band. Outside of Metallica, anyway.
Well, indeed. But no, I've written that down, mate. I'm going to go look for that.
Yeah, and then as always, you can catch me on Mondays on 70s Rock Fans channel, and sometimes on Saturdays for Bourbon and Boarding if the Bruins are involved.
You'll be there.
And if the Bruins and Avalanche make it into the Stanley Cup final, me and Brahma are going to be having a grand old time shitting on each other constantly.
I'm going to have a great time being in the middle of you, taking the piss out of both of you.
Well, I mean, is that going to be refereeing or is that going to be a third man in?
A third man in, I would say. I'll just pile on whoever's losing. I would suspect that my guess now is we're going to get a Seattle Islanders final. Stanley Cup final.
Just to throw everybody off.
Just to throw everybody off. We're going to get the least expected final. Seattle Islanders.
Yeah, it sometimes happens, man. But we're here for it either way, and hopefully you guys will join us for all that because it's going to be a fun couple of weeks here. And as always, I can't wait to see what the Rowdies do with their show because they are actually talking about doing like actual live events and recording all that. That's going to be great.
They are, and I'm hoping to be a part of that. There's talk of whatever. We'll see how it works out, but I could be an MC. I could do that.
Absolutely, man. And we'll keep you guys updated on all of that anyway. And I may have some recorded content that I'm going to be doing on Rumble in the future because I used to do these, Rock and Roll Religion episodes, not live, but I used to just record a little spiel. So I may go back and do that and actually be able to play the songs behind it for once. So, because Rumble is apparently much more forgiving than YouTube is. Mm-hmm. So I may put some of that stuff up from time to time, especially if I find a new song. Like I think the first one I'm going to do, maybe with a couple of guests, is the new Sabaton cover of 1916 by Motorhead.
Oh, right.
It's brilliant. And we will get into that.
That's an unusual track as well. That's an unusual track in the first place.
It is. And one of my favorites from that too, because a different sound by a
very different. Yeah. Cool. Nice. Good. Look forward to that, mate.
Absolutely, man. And hopefully you guys will join me for that. And until then, take care. Stay safe.
Good night, everybody.
And I'll catch you next time.